The glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room, the faint hum of a distant car engine barely audible over the ticking of the old wooden clock on the wall. 12-year-old Lily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her parents had tucked her in hours ago, but sleep wouldn't come. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the windows. She rolled over, pulling the covers up to her chin. The room felt different tonight, heavier somehow, as if the air itself was watching her. She glanced at the doorway, where a sliver of light from the hall spilled in. Her parents' voices, muffled and calm, floated up from the living room. Comforted by their presence, she tried to focus on her breathing, counting each inhale and exhale. But then a soft sound broke through the silence, a faint scratching coming from the closet. Her eyes snapped open, her body freezing as her heart thudded in her chest. She told herself it was nothing, probably a mouse or the wind. She forced her gaze to the ceiling again, willing her racing thoughts to calm. The scratching grew louder. Lily's breath hitched. She slowly turned her head toward the closet, the door of which stood slightly ajar. Her parents always told her to keep it closed, but she had forgotten tonight. The darkness inside seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing the dim light of her lamp. She debated calling out for her parents, but they'd tell her it was her imagination. She was too old to be afraid of the closet, they'd say. Summoning her courage, she sat up, clutching the blanket tightly. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, a void so deep it seemed to press against her ears. She stared at the closet, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might wake the whole house. Just as she began to think she'd imagined it, the door creaked open wider, inch by inch. Lily gasped, her hands gripping the edges of the blanket. She couldn't see anything inside, just an abyss of blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolence. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. And then a voice came, low and rasping, barely above a whisper. Lily. Her name hung in the air like a curse. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, her eyes wide with terror. "Who's there?" she stammered, her voice cracking. The voice didn't answer. Instead, a pale hand emerged from the shadows, its fingers impossibly long, tipped with sharp, claw-like nails. The hand gripped the edge of the doorframe, and a face began to materialize, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore straight into her soul. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. Lily screamed, scrambling backward until her back hit the headboard. The creature crawled out of the closet, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. It was tall, its bony frame stretching unnaturally as it unfolded itself from the confined space. "Don't be afraid," it hissed, its voice dripping with mockery. "I just want to play." Lily's scream brought the sound of hurried footsteps from downstairs. Her father burst into the room, flipping on the overhead light. "What's going on?" he demanded, his eyes scanning the room. The creature was gone. The closet door was closed, the room exactly as it had been before. Lily pointed frantically at the closet, her words tumbling over each other. "There was something in there. It came out. It said my name." Her father sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It was just a nightmare, Lily. There's nothing in the closet." He crossed the room, opening the door wide to reveal a row of neatly hung clothes and a pile of shoes. "See? Nothing." "But I saw it," Lily insisted, tears streaming down her face. Her mother appeared in the doorway, her expression softening when she saw Lily's terror. "Honey, it's okay. You're safe. It's just your imagination." She sat on the bed, pulling Lily into a hug. "How about we leave the light on tonight, okay?" Lily nodded reluctantly, though she knew what she had seen. Her parents tucked her back into bed, reassuring her once more before leaving the room. The light overhead buzzed softly, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. She kept her eyes on the closet, afraid to blink. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Time felt strange. Her body ached with exhaustion, but she couldn't let herself fall asleep. Her parents had to be right. It was just a nightmare. She repeated it to herself like a mantra. Then the light flickered. Once, twice, and went out. Darkness enveloped the room, thicker than it should have been, as if the absence of light had substance. Lily clutched her blanket, every muscle in her body tensed. Her eyes darted to the closet, now hidden in the oppressive blackness. A low chuckle echoed through the room, chilling her to the core. "You can't hide forever, Lily," the voice whispered, closer now. The last thing she saw before everything went to black was the closet door slowly creaking open. The house had always been eerily silent at night, a heavy kind of quiet that made every little noise seem magnified. Emma hated it, but she couldn't say no to her babysitting job. The Davises paid well, and her parents always said the money would help her when she started college next year. The kids, Mia and Jason, were easy enough to manage. They were already in bed by the time Emma settled on the couch with her phone. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the minutes with an unnerving rhythm. Outside, the wind howled, and the trees scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers. Emma scrolled through her phone, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. Around 10 p.m., she heard something. A faint thud from upstairs. She froze, the glow of her phone screen casting sharp shadows on her face. It was probably just the kids, she told herself. Maybe one of them had rolled out of bed or dropped a toy. Reluctantly, she stood and made her way up the stairs, the old wooden steps creaking under her weight. She peeked into Jason's room first. He was fast asleep, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. Next was Mia's room. The little girl was also sound asleep, her blanket pulled up to her chin. Emma sighed in relief and turned to leave, but then she heard it again. A soft thud, this time from the hallway. She spun around, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called out softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. No response. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by a single nightlight plugged into the wall. At the far end was the attic door, its pull-down ladder folded up and shut. She stared at it, dread coiling in her stomach. The Davises hadn't mentioned anything about the attic, and she had no reason to go up there. Another thud. This time it was unmistakable. It came from the attic. Emma's throat tightened. Her instincts screamed at her to stay away. But a small part of her, fueled by a mix of curiosity and fear, pushed her forward. She reached the attic door and stared at the string dangling down, swaying slightly as if someone had just touched it. Her hands shook as she grabbed the string and pulled. The ladder unfolded with a loud creak, revealing a gaping black hole above. A stale, cold draft rushed down, carrying with it the scent of dust and something metallic. "Is someone up there?" she called, her voice trembling. Silence. Emma considered calling the police, but what would she even say? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that whatever was up there was waiting for her. Against her better judgment, she climbed the ladder, each step groaning under her weight. When her head finally breached the attic's opening, she hesitated. Her phone's flashlight was her only source of illumination, casting a narrow beam of light that barely penetrated the darkness. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the flashlight. She scanned the space, her heart racing, and then she saw it. In the far corner, a figure crouched in the shadows. At first, Emma thought it was a mannequin. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its face was pale and featureless. But then it moved, its head snapping up to reveal hollow, black eyes that seemed to drink in the light. Emma froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The figure began to rise, its movements jerky and wrong, like a broken puppet. It was taller than she'd expected, its head nearly brushing the low attic ceiling. "Get out," it whispered, the words slithering through the air like a hiss. Emma stumbled back, nearly falling off the ladder. She scrambled down as fast as she could, her heart hammering against her ribs. The moment her feet hit the hallway floor, she slammed the attic door shut and bolted down the stairs. She grabbed her phone and called the Davises, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hit the buttons. "Mrs. Davis," she cried when the call connected. "There's something in the attic." There was a pause on the other end, and then Mrs. Davis's voice came, calm but strained. "Emma, we've told you before. Don't open the attic." Emma's blood ran cold. "What? You didn't tell me anything about that!" But the call disconnected before Mrs. Davis could respond. Emma stared at her phone, panic gripping her. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps came from upstairs, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. And then, the soft whisper reached her ears again, this time from the top of the stairs. "Why didn't you listen?" Emma turned to look, and her scream echoed through the empty house. The rain battered against the windows, a relentless downpour that turned the streets into rivers. Mia had always loved storms. They made her tiny apartment feel cozy, like a safe little haven against the chaos outside. She pulled the blankets up to her chin and settled into bed, the faint glow of her bedside lamp painting the walls with soft, warm light. It was just after midnight when she heard the first sound, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. At first, she thought it was the rain, but the sound wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside her room. Mia froze, her heart pounding as she strained to listen. The tapping stopped, leaving the apartment eerily silent. She shook her head, laughing nervously to herself. It was probably just the pipes or something outside. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, intending to scroll through social media to distract herself, but as her hand brushed against it, the tapping resumed, louder this time. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room where the sound seemed to originate. The shadows there were thick, almost too dark for the dim lamp to penetrate. She stared, unblinking, her breath caught in her throat. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. The tapping stopped again, but now there was something else, a soft rustling like fabric brushing against wood. Mia sat up, clutching the blanket tightly. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe a bird had gotten in somehow, or a branch was scraping against the outside wall. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. Slowly she approached the corner, her heart thundering in her chest. The shadows seemed to move, shifting as if alive. She hesitated, her fingers inches away from the lamp's switch. She flicked it off, plunging the room into darkness, then flicked it back on. The corner was empty. She let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over her. She was just scaring herself. Turning back toward the bed, she froze. The figure was standing there now, at the foot of her bed. It was tall and impossibly thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its face was wrong, a grotesque amalgamation of features that didn't belong together. A crooked mouth that stretched too wide, eyes that were sunken yet somehow glimmered in the light, and a head tilted at an unnatural angle. Mia screamed, stumbling backward into the corner she just inspected. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared at her, its head twitching slightly as if trying to decide what to do next. "What do you want?" Mia choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head further, the sound of cracking bones filling the room. Slowly, it raised a skeletal hand, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with jagged nails. "You left the window open," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves crumbling. Mia's mind raced. The window? No, she was sure she'd locked everything. But before she could process the words, the figure took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. She bolted for the door, her hand fumbling with the lock as panic clouded her thoughts. Finally, she wrenched it open and ran into the hallway, slamming the door behind her. Her breathing was ragged as she pressed her back against the door, listening. The apartment was silent again, no footsteps, no tapping, just the sound of rain hammering against the building. Summoning her courage, she peeked through the peephole. Her room was empty. Shaking, she made her way down the hall to her neighbor's door and knocked frantically. An older woman named Mrs. Cortez answered, her face lined with confusion and concern. "Mia? What's wrong?" There's someone in my apartment," Mia stammered. Mrs. Cortez grabbed her phone, ready to call the police. But when they returned to Mia's apartment a few minutes later, the place was empty. No sign of forced entry, no strange figure. The only thing out of place was her window, which was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the stormy wind. Mia swore she had locked it before going to bed. As Mrs. Cortez assured her it was probably just a bad dream, Mia's eyes drifted to the shadows in the corner of her room. They seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if something was still watching her. When she finally worked up the courage to sleep again, she didn't notice the faint, wet footprints leading from her bed to the open window. The small, run-down motel sat alone on the edge of a forgotten highway, surrounded by miles of nothingness. Olivia was used to traveling for work, but she hated nights like this. Too tired to drive any farther, she had no choice but to stop at places like this one. The man at the front desk had been odd, staring at her for a moment too long before handing over the key to room 104. His teeth were yellowed, his smile too wide. "Sleep tight," he'd said, his voice low and raspy. The room itself wasn't much better. The air was stale, the wallpaper peeling, and the single overhead light flickered occasionally. Still, Olivia reminded herself it was just for one night. She locked the door, checked the window latch, and set her suitcase on the bed. After a quick shower, she sat on the edge of the mattress, scrolling through her phone to unwind. The muffled sound of the wind outside was the only noise he liked, but it felt like the silence pressed against her ears, amplifying her unease. Then she heard it, a faint scratching sound. She froze, her fingers hovering over her phone screen. It was coming from the wall behind her, scratching like nails dragging across wood or plaster. Trying to shake off the creeping dread, she told herself it was probably mice or some other pest. These places weren't exactly known for cleanliness. But then the scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. She turned her head slowly toward the wall. The tapping grew louder, deliberate, and then it moved. It was no longer coming from the wall, but from the ceiling above her. Olivia's breath hitched as she stared up at the discolored tiles. The tapping was directly above her now, and it sounded heavier than a rodent. Her pulse quickened as she stood, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as the tapping began to move again, toward the corner of the room. Suddenly, it stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. Her breathing felt deafening in the stillness. She stepped backward, her eyes scanning the room, every shadow seeming to twist and ripple in the dim light. The single ceiling tile in the corner shifted, lifting slightly, as if something was pushing it from above. Olivia stumbled back, her foot catching on the edge of the bed, and she fell hard onto the mattress. She scrambled to her feet just as the tile slid completely to the side, and something pale and bony began to emerge. It moved unnaturally, its limbs long and thin, fingers curling as it crawled headfirst out of the hole. Its face was obscured by a mop of dark, stringy hair, but Olivia could feel its gaze on her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The creature hung from the ceiling for a moment, its head tilting in sharp, jerky movements. Then it began to descend. Its arms stretched impossibly long as it lowered itself toward the floor, its head twisting to the side as if studying her. Olivia's paralysis broke, and she bolted for the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. Behind her, she heard it hit the ground with a wet thud. The lock finally gave way, and she threw open the door, sprinting into the cold night air. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her hands shaking as she jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out of the parking lot, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the doorway of room 104, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching her leave. As Olivia sped down the highway, the adrenaline slowly began to fade, replaced by a chilling realization. She had locked the door behind her when she'd arrived. Whatever was in that room hadn't come in through the door. The small cabin in the woods was supposed to be an escape, a quiet retreat where Jenna could finally finish the novel she'd been struggling with for months. It was isolated, with no Wi-Fi, no distractions, and miles of forest in every direction. Perfect, she thought. The first 2 nights were uneventful, the silence of the woods almost soothing. But on the 3rd night, something changed. It started with a faint sound, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, a soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on the gravel path outside. Jenna paused, the pen in her hand hovering over her notebook, and listened. Crunch, crunch. She tried to brush it off, probably just an animal. But when the sound stopped right outside the cabin door, her stomach tightened. She waited, heart pounding, straining to hear any other noise. Minutes passed, and there was nothing. With a nervous laugh, she shook her head and returned to her writing. That night, she woke to the sound of tapping. It was faint at first, like a single finger against glass. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and looked toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, more insistent now. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the bedside lamp and turned it on. The soft glow illuminated the room, but when she pulled back the curtain, there was nothing outside but darkness. The tapping stopped. She tried to sleep, but every rustle of the wind, every creak of the cabin seemed amplified in the stillness. The next morning, Jenna found footprints in the dirt outside the window. They were human, barefoot, and led into the dense forest. She decided not to think too much about it. It was a remote area. Maybe some hiker had gotten lost. Still, she locked the cabin door that night and pushed a chair in front of it, just in case. But the tapping returned. This time it was louder, more deliberate. It moved from the window to the walls, then to the door, as if whoever or whatever was outside was circling the cabin. Jenna sat frozen in bed, clutching the blanket, her ears straining for any other sound. And then it came. A whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable, a voice just outside the door. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was soft, almost playful. Her phone had no service, and the landline in the cabin was just for show, completely dead. She grabbed the fireplace poker, her only weapon, and crept toward the door. The whispers stopped. Jenna held her breath, her hand hovering over the doorknob, and then a loud bang reverberated through the cabin as something slammed against the door. She screamed, stumbling backward, the poker clattering to the floor. The banging continued, relentless, shaking the flimsy door in its frame. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Jenna's heart was in her throat as she waited, listening to the oppressive silence. Minutes passed, then an hour, and she finally worked up the courage to peek through the window. The gravel path was empty. The next morning, she packed her things, determined to leave the cabin and never return. But when she stepped outside, her blood ran cold. Carved into the wooden door in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "You can't leave." Her car wouldn't start, and when she looked back toward the forest, she saw them. Dozens of figures, pale and motionless, standing just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. The old farmhouse had been abandoned for years, a crumbling relic of a family long forgotten. It was the kind of place kids dared each other to enter on Halloween, a spot whispered about in hushed tones at the local diner. When Dylan and his friends decided to spend the night there, it was supposed to be a joke, a thrilling story to brag about later. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, and their flashlights danced over peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The living room held a faded photograph of a family, their faces blurred with age and water damage. "Creepy," Sarah muttered, holding the photo up. "Perfect," Dylan grinned. "Let's see if this place is really haunted." The group set up their sleeping bags in the main hall, the most intact room in the house. As the night deepened, the wind howled through the cracks, making the old boards creak. It wasn't long before the strange noises began. At first, it was faint, soft footsteps echoing from the second floor. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, though his voice wavered. But the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, pacing back and forth. Then a single loud thud, like something heavy falling to the floor. "I'm checking it out," Dylan declared, grabbing his flashlight. "No way," Sarah hissed, clutching Jake's arm. "Stay here, scaredy cats," Dylan smirked and headed up the stairs. The creaking of the old staircase was loud in the stillness, and they listened intently as his footsteps faded. Minutes passed. "Dylan?" Sarah called out. No answer. Jake grabbed his flashlight. "We can't just sit here. Let's find him." Reluctantly, Sarah followed, the beam of her flashlight trembling as they climbed the stairs. The second floor was colder, the air thick with a damp, earthy smell. "Dylan?" Jake called, his voice bouncing down the dark hallway. A door at the end of the hall creaked open slowly, as if pushed by an unseen hand. Jake and Sarah froze. "Dylan, stop messing around." The silence that followed was oppressive, and Sarah felt her stomach drop when a voice finally came. "It's not Dylan." A raspy whisper echoed from the darkness. The flashlight flickered, and Sarah screamed as something darted across the hallway, too fast to see clearly. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the stairs. But the stairs were gone. Where the staircase had been was now an endless void of black, stretching down into nothingness. The hallway behind them stretched, the walls peeling and warping, the old wood cracking as if the house itself were alive. A low growl came from the room at the end of the hall, followed by a dragging sound. "Run!" Jake shouted, yanking Sarah down the hall. They stumbled into a room, slamming the door behind them. The air was stifling, the walls pulsing like they were breathing. "Where's Dylan?" Sarah sobbed. Jake didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the corner of the room where a figure crouched, its back to them. It was rocking slowly, its shoulders heaving. "Dylan?" Jake whispered. The figure turned, and Sarah's scream echoed through the house. It wasn't Dylan. Its face was a grotesque mask of rotting flesh, its hollow eyes staring straight through them. It grinned, revealing teeth too sharp, too many. "Leave," it rasped. "You don't belong here." They didn't need to be told twice. The door behind them swung open on its own, revealing the staircase again, though it now spiraled downward like a twisted funhouse. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. Behind them, the growl returned, louder, closer. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, the front door always just out of reach. When they finally burst outside, the air was cold and still. The house loomed behind them, its windows like empty eyes. They ran to the car, gasping for breath, but Dylan was nowhere to be seen. The police searched for days, but found no trace of him. A week later, Sarah received a text from Dylan's number. It was a photo of the old family portrait from the farmhouse, except now Dylan was in it. The rain came down in relentless sheets as Megan pulled her car onto the winding country road. She'd gotten lost hours ago, her GPS refusing to cooperate in the storm. The only sign of life for miles had been the small gas station she'd passed earlier, its lone attendant mumbling something about staying on the main roads. But the detour seemed quicker, and Megan just wanted to get home. The road narrowed as the forest thickened around her, sere branches clawing at the edges of the headlights. The storm grew worse, thunder rolling across the sky, lightning illuminating the eerie emptiness of the woods. That's when she saw it. A figure stood on the side of the road, drenched, its head bowed. Megan slowed, the car's tires skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. The figure was a woman, her long dark hair matted to her face. She wore a pale dress that clung to her skin, and she didn't seem to notice the rain. Megan rolled down her window just enough to call out, "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman slowly lifted her head, and Megan's stomach dropped. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, her eyes wide and dark, staring through Megan as if she weren't there. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she pointed down the road, her arm trembling. Megan hesitated but nodded. "Okay, get in." The woman climbed into the back seat without a word, water pooling on the upholstery. Megan tried to suppress her unease as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman sat stiffly, staring out the window. "What's your name?" Megan asked, her voice shaky. The woman didn't respond. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the road ahead. For a moment, Megan thought she saw something. Another figure standing in the middle of the street. She slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding, but when the car skidded to a stop, the road was empty. She turned to the woman in the back seat, but the seat was empty. Megan's breath caught in her throat. The rain continued to pour, the rhythmic tapping against the roof the only sound. She turned on the interior light, frantically checking the back seat. There was nothing, no water, no sign anyone had been there. Her shaking hands gripped the wheel as she started driving again, desperate to get off the cursed road. That's when she saw it again. The woman standing on the side of the road, pointing. Megan's heart raced as she sped past, her pulse pounding in her ears. But a few moments later, the woman was ahead of her again, always the same distance away, always pointing. Megan couldn't stop herself this time. She slammed on the brakes and got out, the rain soaking her instantly. "What do you want?" she screamed into the storm. The woman turned slowly to face her, and Megan's blood turned to ice. Her eyes were gone, replaced by gaping black voids. Her mouth opened wide, too wide, an unnatural grin splitting her face as a guttural sound escaped her throat. Megan stumbled backward, tripping over the wet road as the woman began to walk toward her. She scrambled to her feet, rushing back to the car, but as she opened the door, the woman was suddenly inside, sitting in the driver's seat, staring at her through the windshield. Megan screamed, slamming the door shut and running into the woods. She didn't stop until her legs gave out, the storm swallowing her cries. When she was finally found the next morning, she was miles from her car, soaked to the bone and mumbling incoherently. The authorities searched for the vehicle, but found no trace. The locals, however, knew better. "She's just another victim," the old gas station attendant said with a sigh. "That road's been cursed for decades. Once she points the way, there's no coming back." The clock read 3:14 a.m. when Ava woke to the sound of creaking floorboards. Her eyes darted to the closed bedroom door. She lived alone in her one-bedroom apartment on the 6th floor, and there was no reason anyone should be inside. She told herself it was the building settling, a logical explanation she'd clung to when noises disrupted her late-night writing sessions. But tonight, something about the sound was different, deliberate. Pulling the blanket tighter around her, Ava strained her ears. Creak. Pause. Creak. The sound was closer now, just outside her bedroom. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, but her hand froze when she heard the soft click of her doorknob turning. Her breath caught as the door slowly swung open, revealing nothing but the darkened hallway beyond. Ava's trembling hand finally found her phone. She turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the door, the light cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Heart pounding, she slid out of bed, gripping the phone tightly. She crept to the door, peering into the hallway. The living room was silent, the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. But then she saw it. The closet door in the hallway was ajar. Ava was certain she'd closed it before bed. The silence pressed against her ears as she stared at the crack in the door, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Is someone there?" she whispered. No response. Summoning what little courage she had, Ava stepped forward, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She reached for the closet door, her fingers brushing against the cold metal handle. With a deep breath, she yanked it open. The closet was empty. Relief flooded her, though it was short-lived. As she turned to head back to her bedroom, something caught her eye. On the wall, just above the light switch, were words scratched into the plaster. "You're not alone." Ava's blood ran cold. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream as the sound of faint breathing filled the air behind her. She spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the hallway, but there was no one there. The breathing stopped. Panicking, she bolted for her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. She pressed her back against the door, her pulse racing as she fumbled to call 911. As the phone rang, a soft tapping began on the other side of the door. Tap, tap, tap. 911, what's your emergency? Ava's voice shook as she whispered, "Someone's in my apartment. Please send help." The operator assured her that officers were on the way, but the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, and then it stopped altogether. The silence was deafening. Ava held her breath, the phone clutched tightly to her ear. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, until finally, red and blue lights flashed through her bedroom window. She opened the door cautiously, relieved to see 2 officers standing in her living room. "There's someone here," Ava stammered. "They were outside my bedroom." The officers searched the apartment thoroughly, checking every corner, every closet. They found no one. One of the officers approached her, his expression grim. "The front door was locked, and there are no signs of forced entry," he said. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" Ava wanted to argue, but her voice faltered. Maybe it had been her imagination, she thought. Maybe the stress of working late nights had gotten to her. But as the officers prepared to leave, one of them stopped, his gaze fixed on the hallway wall. "Did you do this?" he asked, pointing to the scratched words. Ava's stomach dropped. "No," she whispered. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them stepped outside to radio for backup. The other stayed with Ava, trying to reassure her, but neither of them noticed the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the bedroom window, watching. It was the kind of night that made even silence feel loud. Ethan sat up in bed, his ears straining against the oppressive stillness of his apartment. Something had woken him, though he couldn't pinpoint what. He glanced at the clock, 3:33 a.m., the time when the world always seemed eeriest. He shifted in bed, trying to convince himself it was just a bad dream. Then he heard it again, a faint rustling sound coming from the living room. He froze. Ethan lived alone. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a random noise, it was deliberate, like someone or something moving through the apartment. His heart pounded as he grabbed his phone, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the room. He turned on the flashlight and crept toward the door, his bare feet silent against the floorboards. As he stepped into the hallway, the rustling stopped. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" No response. Ethan's pulse quickened as he made his way toward the living room, the beam of light bouncing across the walls. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways, but the room was empty. Then, his eyes landed on the source of the sound. The curtain over the window was swaying as if someone had brushed past it, but the window was closed, locked from the inside. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He turned, scanning the room, and that's when he noticed something new, a smell, faint but distinct, like earth and decay. It was coming from the hallway behind him. He spun around, his flashlight catching the briefest glimpse of movement, a shadow slipping into his bedroom. Panic set in as he rushed back, the smell growing stronger with every step. He burst into the room, his flashlight darting across the walls, but nothing was there, except the closet door. It was open just a crack, though he distinctly remembered closing it before bed. Ethan's hands trembled as he approached the door, the smell now almost overpowering. He reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of the wood. Before he could pull it open, the door slammed shut with a force that sent him stumbling backward. His flashlight flickered, plunging the room into near darkness. And then he heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from inside the closet. "Leave." Ethan's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move, bolting out of the room and into the hallway. He grabbed his keys and fled the apartment, not stopping until he was in his car, the doors locked, the engine roaring to life. He spent the rest of the night in a nearby motel, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. When morning came, he returned to the apartment with a friend for backup. The place was silent, the smell gone, but his bedroom told a different story. The closet door was wide open, and the words, "I told you," were scratched into the inside of the wood, deep and jagged. Ethan moved out the next day, but the nightmare stayed with him. No matter where he went, he could still smell it. The scent of earth and decay, growing stronger whenever the clock struck 3:33 a.m.